with my partner, became pregnant, was happy, delighted, felt really confident in my body and my work, in myself, and was doing work with women-only groups on, Our Body, Ourselves was a book that informed my practice. I was very involved in a number of different communities. And then this thing happened. And it was a tremendous loss, on a par, but very different from the sense of loss of identity I had felt in my late teens when I had the really traumatic experience. And clearly having an ectopic pregnancy at 3 months was very traumatic and was also life-threatening.
Every L podcast. Every L podcast.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Matt Brown, and you're listening to the
Every L podcast.
Each episode, we'll have a different guest come on and talk about when life hands you an L, is it really a loss or is it something else?
Because not every L's a loss.
So sit back, relax, or do whatever you guys do to get comfortable as we get into this. Let's go. Welcome everybody to another episode of Every L podcast, where we have different guests come on and share their experiences that they've gone through in life. If you don't understand the concept of what an L is, an L, if you look at it in binary terms in life, you're either going to win or you're going to lose. You might stack things up in a certain way. You've done all the prep work, all the groundwork, the occasion comes and you just flop. It just doesn't deliver like you want it to. And that feels like a major L that you're holding. And at that point, you might want the earth to open up and swallow you in, or just to curl up in a ball and not see the world for the rest of the year. Whatever it is, it's not a good feeling. But it doesn't necessarily mean that L that you've caught at that moment will always be an L later on in life when you look back. And that's what we're going to talk about with these various lovely guests that I have on. And I'm so grateful for each and every one of them for taking the time out to share these stories and to be as open and honest and to help other people feel less alone. Now, as I say, as always, because it's very cliche, but it's so accurate, I have another fantastic guest. This individual I've known probably about a year now or something like that. But you know, when you have such good time speaking and getting to know someone over a period of time that you don't really put a time scale to it. You're just like, good vibes, good people, checking on them, see what they're doing. And secretly, part of the reason why you hang around them as much as you do is because you're inspired by them, how they conduct themselves, how they perform the daily tasks they do. And don't get it wrong, what you see on social media isn't necessarily reality, and I'm very aware of that. However, if they're consistently showing up and the things they put out, the standards they maintain are things that you want to do as well, oh, hold on to them, hang around them as much as possible. And this person is no exception to that. She's also a podcast host, and well, she's got other qualities, which I will not delve into. I'll let her talk about in her introduction. But it does encourage me to know that even though we do podcasting, which is the same medium, we do it very differently. But at the same time, there are similarities, which sounds very confusing, but it's a bit like humans. We're different, but we're the same. We're not too dissimilar. And I take so much away from what she does. I love how she presents herself. I love how she's catering for a demographic that may not know they need to be catered for, and giving hope to those that are trying to break out of wherever they are in their life, their career, and want to step into another realm, but don't know what that looks like. But she's facilitating that by speaking to all these guests, all these different leaders, and just showing them this is what it looks like. Yes, they might have this fancy title. Yes, they might be in this sphere, but they probably wear jeans and a t-shirt like you and I do. And this is what they sound like, and this is what they want to share. And yes, they have their own insecurities they have to battle through like the rest of us, but they still show up, which is important, and whatever else they want to share, which is gems, and that is invaluable. I thank her for it. I absolutely love what she does. I love what she's about. And so grateful for her taking the time to come and jump on the podcast today. But without going on too long and making her head get so big she can't leave her office, Annie, how are you doing today?
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and in particular for mentioning about the checking in, because that's what you have done with me when we were first introduced to each other by one of your podcast guests, who's also one of my podcast guests, called Karen Dobres. And I listened to your talking with her. And although I've known her for many years, there were things that I didn't know. And she's a really inspiring woman, an equity advisor, and who I met through when our children were attending the same school. What I've loved is how you have checked in with me regularly. You first asked me to be a guest on your show just around the time when my mother had died, and I wasn't ready to talk privately or publicly about the loss that I felt when she died. So I am ready now. I needed that time, but what I've really loved is the way you have hung around me and checked in with me. We've messaged each other on Instagram, and I want to also congratulate you on your award for your podcast, which is truly well deserved.
Well, unfortunately, it's just a nomination, but I'll take it. I'll take it.
I count a nomination as an award. And, it is a nomination, and that in and of itself is an award. You're listed there, Matt, and well-deserved.
Much appreciated.
Recognition for your podcast, for giving people the opportunity to speak about loss. My full name is Anni Townend. There will be people who've heard me speak about this before. I haven't always been called Annie, but I have always been called Townend. And often when I'm meeting a team and or a group for the first time, whether that's online or in the room, and I want to hear a little bit about everybody in the room, I will invite them to say something about who they are through their name, which is a really brilliant way of people sharing just a snippet of their story. And so a snippet of my story is that until my mother died, she was really the last person who still called me by the name I was given, the first name that I was given when I was born. So she and my dad called me Anne. And I spent my life up until I was 18 years old telling people that my name was spelt Anne with an E. I changed my name officially when I was 18, and that came about, and perhaps it will be reflected in some of what I share today around losing myself and finding myself. And when I found myself, or began the journey at that time, I felt myself to be an Annie, and that's Annie with an I, no E. So it was only when I was introducing myself to a team a few months ago that I thought, oh my, I spent my first 18 years saying I'm Anne with an E, and I've spent the rest of my life saying I'm Annie, that's no E. But I think that's relevant. And probably a couple of years ago, I was described by an HR director to their chief exec as experienced and edgy. And I think that I am very experienced, and I think I do bring a bit of edge. And from permaculture and from the gardening world, which is important to me, although I would never describe myself as a gardener, being outside in nature is very, very important to me. And in permaculture, there is a phrase which is about growth happens at the edges. And I think many of my lessons from loss and my learnings, which are ongoing, have come at the edge of when I've been at the edge. So I will talk about that too.
I like that. Growth is at the edge. That wow. Okay, I'm gonna have to marinate on that a little bit. That was Wow.
Marinate on it. Yeah, definitely do. Because when you next go for a walk and you look at pavements, at the edges, in outside, wherever, and often at the edges of in rooms, that's where there is biodiversity. That's where lots of different things are going on, and there's lots of growth. And I think when I apply that to lessons from loss, and indeed in leadership and living and leading our lives, for me, it has been a process of making sense of my losses. And with that has come, greater, I hope, wisdom, but also a greater sense of knowing who I am and my losses and the learnings from them being part of who I am. Something that I learned a few months ago from a webinar that I was invited to co-lead with a colleague. And I was asked to describe myself, and I didn't describe myself through my name. What I did was asked to do was to describe myself in physical terms, so that those people who weren't able to see would be able to have a sense of who I was. So I thought I would do that as well, and let your listeners know that I live in the UK, and I've mentioned the garden already. I am in my shed in the garden in East Sussex.
I'm in my
And
summer house. That helps.
that's great. Where is your garden, Matt? Where is your summer house?
In Essex.
In Essex. Brilliant. I didn't know where you were based, so now I do, which is great. I'm a white woman. I have grey hair, and I am wearing a pale grey T-shirt. What I do, you've already alluded to the fact that I work with leaders, and my podcast, Leaders in Conversation with Anni Townend, is an opportunity for leaders to share their stories. And I partner with leaders and their teams, helping them to create a safe environment in which people can have conversations that matter, and to do that with curiosity, care, and courage. And you could put in love there. So curiosity, love, and courage. I'm talking about the kind of human to human felt experience of really caring about each other, which is really important to me, as is helping leaders to find ways of creating safe environments. And that will become clearer, I think, in what I'm going to share with you about the lessons I've learned from loss. One of the biggest lessons that I've learnt about noticing loss came from one of my trainings that I went on many years ago. And the training itself was not especially engaging, and we were all sitting in rows and we were taking notes, and it was a slide-led lecture. And when the facilitator lecturer opened up for questions, there was somebody in the audience who asked the question, "This is all well and good and sounds great." It was about facilitating and leading groups and team dynamics. But what do you do when you have a really difficult person in a group? And there was a general sort of laughter and of recognition that sometimes there are people like that. And the lecturer and facilitator paused, quite a long pause, and said, "There's no such thing as a difficult person. There are only people struggling with loss." And that really resonated with me, Matt, because I thought, when I'm struggling with loss, I can be difficult. I find myself difficult. It has been difficult. And it's helped me to really listen with curiosity, care, and courage to people when perhaps they've been awkward, difficult. Maybe they would have been described as difficult. And I've always held this in mind, that there's a lot more going on than I could ever possibly know. And it helps me to bring that love, care, and compassion in the moment, and appreciate that they have shown up, that they are there despite all that might be going on in their lives, that they may or may not yet, like myself, be able to talk about. And I'm very fortunate that I have had over the years huge support, which has helped me in making sense of my losses and to learn from them. And not everybody has that. And I hope that people listening today, but also listening to your other wonderful guests, will feel reassured by that as well, that they can get support from listening to other people's stories. I certainly have.
Amazing. When you mentioned about difficult people, I was thinking, right, if I was in that situation, one of my answers would have been, someone could consider you as a difficult person because you're disrupting the flow of the presentation. But if you offer the question, that's fine. But when it starts getting, everyone else start getting on board, you feel like, hang on, calm down, people. Let's get back on track. But I feel like as well, people are going through a loss. And it could be a loss of understanding because they were following it up until a certain point, and then frustration came in. They're like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what I'm talking about. Is it even the right job for me anymore? I feel at a loss. But it could also mean that the person is in a different place to where you are, and you have to meet them where they're at. And being a good leader should be able to identify that and say, right, those that can continue going on the path that I've set for you, keep going. I'm going to go and get this person, and it's not going to stand over them, towering over them like some parents do to a child and tell them off like, what are you doing? It's sort of like, bend down. Hey, how you doing? You all right? How can I support you? And try and get them on side.
Yeah.
And where you said about loss, and are you familiar with the change curve by any chance?
I am.
So the change curve and the grief curve, very similar. Because in my experience, you've got to adapt and accept your new reality or whatever the new process may be. And because you have to accept something new, it means you've lost what you already knew. And as a creature of habit, it's kind of hard to accept that, because like saying, I wake up in the morning at this time, I go here at that time, I do X, Y, and Z, I check out by that time, I'm going home. But all of a sudden there's roadworks, or there's a new manager, or there's a new process, which you can't understand why there's a new process. The old one's working sound. But this is new and efficient. Mate, it's taking me at least 20 minutes extra to learn how to do it, or whatever the case is. But your head is struggling. You're going through that. And for those that are listening, don't know what the change curve is. The change curve is a sort of roller coaster that you go through when new information or new situations presented to yourself. So in first instance, you go through shock, then you go through denial, then frustration, depression, which is the lowest point of this roller coaster. Then you go into experiment because you're kind of dipping your toe into it. Then you're faced with a decision whether you're going to continue or you're going to go back to not wanting to pursue this further. And then you've got integration, which is where you get in line with everything. And if you think of integration as you're approaching the motorway and you're merging into the main traffic, and at that point, you've got to maintain speed. And if you can't maintain speed, it's not going to be a fun journey for you. But I don't know, would you, after me saying that, can you see the connection between the two? Or am I just going off on a whim here?
I think the change curve and the grief curve are really helpful lenses to think about the experience of losing something, someone, of change, of loss, of grief. And certainly have helped me along my way to make sense of loss and grief. And where I've come to now, Matt, is very much that everyone's experience of loss is different, and that the change curve, the grief curve, which is described beautifully by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her book, for anybody interested, is helpful, as is appreciating that each person's own experience of loss is very different. And what I wanted to talk about with you was the loss of confidence, of losing confidence and finding it, and resilience through my own experience. Because these are two things that have been woven closely together throughout my life. And I thought it would be helpful to talk about losing confidence, losing a sense of self and self-belief, and what has helped me. And one of the things that along my way has helped me to make sense of some of the experiences that I've had, indeed, was discovering that somebody had thought about this curve, and it helped me to make sense of it mentally, whilst probably in my heart still having a way to go. And I love your metaphor of needing to be able to travel at speed, to get on the motorway. And if you're not ready, don't get on it. You know, you might need a little bit longer in the lay-by and or in one of the side roads. And it's that meandering in the side road, stopping in a lay-by and feeling a bit lost with grief, that I think is very personal to everybody.
Definitely. I agree with that.
A nice metaphor, Matt, I must say. When you're not quite ready, like when you first asked me to come and speak about loss, I was right in it. There was no way I was ready to jump in the car with you and head on to the motorway. I wasn't even yet sure I was in the right lay-by, let alone, the road.
And that's the thing. I think it's important to have conversation, because I think at that point, I don't think at that point I knew your mum had passed.
You didn't.
I think it was just a conversation, and later when you let me know, and that was where it's like, that's fine. No harm, no foul. It is what it is. And I think it's important that we talk, but it is hard. And I think it's important to, one, let me go back with the change curve and the grief curve. All those things I mentioned to you in it, they don't necessarily go in that order. It's just as
helpful.
Yeah, it's a helpful guide. But also, it's just letting people know that when you're going through something like that, I'll be there and support wherever I can. The reason why I guess I can use a lot of metaphors is because I'm very open and try to express my emotion in the best way possible. I feel what I feel, so that when I talk to other people about what they're going through, I can hopefully have a better connection with them and hopefully articulate what they're trying to, just because I experience it. I sit in the moment. Don't get it wrong, for those around me, at times it's not the most nice because I'm in a bit of a mood, but it's because I'm feeling what I am feeling. So when I have conversations like this or speaking to others, I'm able to articulate what maybe they struggle to, because they're not allowed to feel what they're feeling, because their schedule is so hectic. They cannot afford to. And as we're talking, we know there's a cost of living crisis going on in the UK and probably across the world. So everyone's all about, I need to get paid, because if I don't get paid, there's going to be more stress, which is going to be more detrimental to my health, not to my mental health, my physical and everything else. And this is where I think it's important that we do talk to the right people, because some people just want to gossip. We don't want those people, but talk to the right people so they can offer you the right support. And sometimes that support is just knowing that they're there if and when you need them, whether it's to ramble, whether it's just to keep you feeling like they acknowledge you as the individual. Like you said, you lost your confidence and identity and stuff like that. Sometimes when you are lost in a moment like that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, when you're in a new environment, a new situation, you can lose who you are because you're not willing to embrace the new version of your reality. And that confidence, some people will not know who you are, but those that know who you are will continue to be there with you, sit with you, and be saying, when you're ready to drive, we'll drive. When you're ready to merge, we'll merge, but not a moment too soon.
I love that, Matt. And something you said really resonates with me about meeting people where they are at. And I think I'd like to talk about where I lost my confidence, my self-belief, and how I found it again. And it's certainly, finding it was through being met where I was at. And I think earlier on in our conversation, you mentioned the kind of parents who were like my parents, very disciplinarian, particularly my father. So there was a lot of telling me what to do, telling me who I was. And that contributed to my not really knowing who I was. And somebody once spoke to me about how they felt as if they had been bent out of shape by some of their experiences. And I remember thinking, that's kind of what happened to me when I was a child. I was bent out of shape. In other words, I was bent out of my own shape. And it took me quite a long time to find my confidence, my self-belief, and to bend back into my self, into my own shape, my true shape. And that came through searching for meaning and purpose, which I had also lost. My parents, when I look back, they're both dead now, very much wanted to give me and my sister opportunities that they didn't have. And for them, that was education. They wanted us to have a good education. And what mattered to them is that we did well. And I was very happy at my first school, my primary school. I remember it. I used to walk to school with my mum, my sister, and I made two very special friends there called Suzanne and Timothy, who, when my parents decided to have me move schools to go to a different school, I lost contact with completely. And instead of walking to school with my mum and my friends, my father drove me to school in another town, the town in which he worked. And he was a very hard worker. They were both hard workers. And at the time, in the early 60s, having children, as they had me and my sister, my mum stopped working as a teacher and became a full-time housewife. And looking back on that, she also worked very hard in the house, in the home, in looking after us, as he did through his work. But they had very, very distinct roles. But what they shared was this ambition for both me and my sister to do well and to go to a good school. And I think our primary school was a good school, but they decided, as I say, to move us to another school in a bigger town. And that's where my father drove me every day and my mum would pick me up. Sometimes after school, we would go and play on the moors with my mum and grandma. I was brought up in Yorkshire. For those listeners who know, I was born and brought up in West Yorkshire, near Halifax. And I'm a very proud Yorkshire lass, as they would say. When I was 10 years old, my parents decided that it was time for me to move schools again, naturally, as in junior school was finished, and they decided to send me to boarding school in a completely different town, far away from home, not in the country, and a long way from everything that I knew, from family, from friends, from the landscape that I knew. So it was my next big experience of loss. So my first experience of loss was the change of school, losing two close friends who I remember to this day, and going to a school again where I didn't know people. When I arrived at the boarding school, I felt very, very different. I felt very lost. And one of the things that I consciously chose to do was to lose my accent. So, not that I had a really broad Yorkshire accent, and those listeners who are from Yorkshire will have already detected my accent. But when I arrived at boarding school, the first thing that I noticed was that I didn't speak like others, and I didn't have the same shared experiences as them either. Many of them had come from families where family members had already been to boarding school. Nobody in my family had ever been to boarding school. And so it was a very alien experience, not only for me, but also for my parents who'd made the decision. I think when I look back on it, I understand why they made the decision, but I was very, very unhappy. And I spent 5 really difficult years being quite difficult, being one of those difficult people. It was difficult, and I think I was difficult when I look back. What my parents were committed to was this good education. However, after 5 years of being there, I was given the choice to come back home and to live back in West Yorkshire with them, which is what I did. And I went to the local comprehensive school. So I rarely talk about having been sent away to boarding school, but it has had a huge impact on my life, of feeling lost and of losing myself during that time. And those years were very formative and very significant in who I've become, really. I don't think I did feel safe. It didn't feel like a particularly safe environment, but that was because it was unknown, unfamiliar. It was a city environment, not a country location. And I already knew from my early years that I was happiest in the countryside. I love being outside. I love walking. My happiest times with my family as a child were those at the weekend when we either walked together or when I often walked on my own. I loved walking and still do.
That is a lot of change to go through at such a young age and young and impressionable age. Did you react negatively or out of character? I say it with quotation marks, out of character, because, you don't know what your character is necessarily if, like you said before, what your parents would tell you was versus what you was never aligned at that point. So did you react in a negative way or out of character to all those changes?
The answer is I don't know, Matt. I didn't know any different, really. And it was only, I remember visiting a friend from boarding school while I was still at that school and going to stay with her and her parents. And that was one of the first times that I realised other families were not as strict and disciplinarian and didn't have the same rules as our family. So my parents had very strict rules, which they themselves probably lived by, but certainly I felt I had to do as I was told and not ask. I've always been naturally curious, and this serves me well in my life and leadership. But probably as a child, it didn't always serve me well, and it got me into trouble. So I was myself, but I was definitely bent out of shape. And when I came back home to live with my parents, it was difficult for them and for me because I'd had 5 years of being away and only being at home during holidays, which had not been easy, really. We'd had fun times, but they were also quite difficult fitting back in and not feeling like I did. Remember that I'd changed to a certain extent the way I spoke. So then my friends at the local church where my parents attended, they thought I was posh. And then when I went back to school, I had to remember to speak like I spoke when I was at school. So I felt this sense of not fitting in either at home or at school. And that did change when I went to the comprehensive school, walked to school again. But it wasn't an easy time. By then I was 16 years old. My parents weren't used to having me there all the time. They used to having their own lives separately, because by then my sister was also at boarding school. So I don't think it was easy for them, and it certainly wasn't easy for me. And there's a lovely quote from Brené Brown. She asked the question, what's the opposite of fitting in? And the answer she gives is
Standing out.
belonging.
Ooh, I like that.
I like that too. So I mention that because that's a really important part of what I think I had lost, was a sense of belonging, and something you said earlier, a feeling of being well met and of being met where I was at. I don't think I felt that in my teenage years, and that's what I lost, was a sense of who I am and of belonging, which I set about finding.
Really insightful. So, do you think the fact that you had to effectively, and there's a term called code switching, where you talk one way with one group of people and then you switch it up for another group of people, do you think that had a negative impact on you getting closer to your identity sooner rather than later?
Possibly, Matt. I think that the importance of being well met, of difference, and of belonging were things that I became acutely aware of. I don't think I knew that I had lost my confidence and resilience in who I was, because I don't know that I knew I'd ever found it. It was only when I left the comprehensive school, where I hadn't done very well, and I didn't get into university to do what I wanted to do, which was art and English, a combined degree. And it was through my father, who at the time read a magazine called Private Eye, and he spotted, I think he was quite desperate that I was going to be living at home for an extended period and keen for me to go somewhere, anywhere. And I was very fortunate. I got in on a BA honours degree in communication studies at what was then Sheffield Polytechnic. And those 3 years were years I look back on of realizing I was a bit lost, because the course had attracted people of all ages from very different backgrounds. It was a very multi-modular course and quite revolutionary for its time. And it was other people's comments, feedback to me that I think made me realize that I was a bit directionless. I was, I didn't really know why I was doing the degree. I found it interesting. I rarely spoke in seminar groups, hardly ever, if at all. And that was partly because of my upbringing and feeling that it was better to be quiet rather than to ask questions. So I definitely internalized some of the messages that I had received, and I was not speaking out. And that's probably why there's another quote I really love, Matt, which has just come to me in this moment. It's a Vanessa Redgrave quote, which she gave when she was awarded something for her service to acting and the whole industry. And she said, "Find your truth and your voice will follow."
I can get behind that.
It's so good, that. And that's what I hadn't found. I was lost. I had been brought up as a Christian, and I had lost that faith, which had, I'd really questioned it and lost it. So by the time I was studying for communication studies, I had lost quite a lot and hadn't really yet found my truth. And now when I look back, I think that's why I had lost my voice. And then I had an extremely traumatic experience, which was to change me. And I describe it as I woke up to myself. And I hadn't, in that experience, really listened to myself. I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust my instincts. I didn't trust my intuition. And I had to get myself out of a really difficult situation, which I did. And afterwards, I knew I needed help. And the help came in various forms. And one of those forms was from an older, wiser woman who said to me, "Would you like to come on this weekend workshop? It's kind of therapy. It's a group therapy workshop." And I had, through my studying psychology, heard of therapy, obviously, but I had no experience of group therapy, of being in a group which was a therapeutic group. And I said yes, because that felt like the right thing to do. And not unlike going to a new school, meeting new people, I knew nobody there. It was completely alien to me. Everybody was sitting in a circle on cushions on the floor, and it was like nothing I'd ever known. However, I felt well met, I felt seen, I felt heard, and I felt understood. The facilitator and everybody that was there and part of that group had me feel a sense of belonging and that I could be myself. And I began to find my truth and my voice. And also, I discovered my métier, Matt. I realised I witnessed this facilitator. I described them, his name was John Heron, as a elegant facilitator. He, with everybody that was there, created this very safe environment in which we did the work we had come to do, whatever that was, and in the way that we did it. And I thought one day, that's what I want to do. I have found what I wanted to do. So it was like a door opening, and not unlike when you think of if I think using a metaphor that perhaps will resonate. It was like having a house and not having knowing that the rooms were there, but never having opened the doors, perhaps through fear of what might be in there. And for me, this weekend workshop helped me to start opening these doors that, for whatever reason, I had closed, and to build the foundations of who I have become. And it was at that time that I changed my name from Anne to Annie.
So it's like you found your identity and you put it out there by saying, please do not address me as this, because this is who I am and I feel empowered by that.
Yeah, it was an internal thing. And then in the day when people sent postcards to each other, I was helped set up and was working in a whole food. When I finished my degree, I'd no idea still what I wanted to do. I'd found my métier around the time I'd finished my degree, but I had no idea really how to realize it. However, at the same time, I chose to study child psychology part-time and to help set up a whole food cooperative, which had a huge, big ambition, which was around recycling. People brought their own bags and jars in. We made sure people knew where the food was sourced from, and we were able to engage in the local community that visited, shopped, and supported what was called Down to Earth in Sheffield, a time I'm really proud of. And we pioneered flexible working, job rotation, and because of that, I was able to study child psychology, but only for a short while, because it was while I was studying and being supervised that my very wise supervisor suggested that maybe child psychology was not for me. And the reason that I was studying it was that I needed to do a bit of digging in my own childhood, and suggested to me that I got some one-to-one therapy, which is what I did. And at the same time, I also knew that I wanted to and believe in the power of groups and working with groups. So that began a whole journey of exploring humanistic psychology, of studying and practicing as a group therapist, and ultimately led me to do a master's in management learning.
And is that what led you into the job role you're doing now, which is in leadership?
Yeah, very much so. So I did the master's when I was in my early 30s, and by then I was living near Lancaster University. I studied in Lancaster and I lived on the moors. I was part of a community, had a sense of belonging, and myself ran workshops, and realised that what I wanted to do was to work with people in the business world, in the corporate world, and across sectors. So that's how I came to do that.
And would it be the case that the reason why you're connected to do it and you're so passionate about it is because in some way you are trying to stop people feeling the loss that you felt kind of just drifting through life or your career, and saying, you may not have found your identity, but here's some other people that look like they've got it together through your conversations. Here, listen to them. Let me help you. And you're tapping into your past experiences and helping reframe it in a way that is positive, to say, you may feel like this, this, and this. Fine. Use that energy and it can become this with the right sense of direction. And I can help you the direction by however you present that information. I'm taking a stab in the dark here. Tell me if I'm right or wrong.
Well, as you take that stab in the dark, it reminds me that there was something that happened. The way I've described the journey makes it sound quite linear, that I discovered humanistic psychology, all the different practices, that I had one-to-one therapy, which helped me to be present to myself, to find my truth, and that I was living in the country, leading and running workshops and doing some training as well for others. And what I haven't shared yet, Matt, which I think is important, is that then I had the first of 3 ectopic pregnancies, which was a huge loss and shock. So there I was, having found my truth and found my purpose, and with my partner became pregnant, was happy, delighted, felt really confident in my body and my work and myself, and was doing work with women-only groups on, Our Body, Ourselves was a book that informed my practice. I was very involved in a number of different communities, and then this thing happened. And it was a tremendous loss, on a par, but very different from the sense of loss of identity I had felt in my late teens when I had the really traumatic experience. And clearly, having an ectopic pregnancy at 3 months was very traumatic and was also life-threatening. Thanks to the NHS, I survived, and I was very changed by it. And I think when I mentioned around confidence and resilience earlier, it took me quite a long time to. I was once again very bent out of shape. Having found myself, I lost myself again through this loss, which was huge. And I wasn't even sure after that first ectopic pregnancy that I would be able to bend back into shape again. So when you said, did that lead you to the work you did, the kind of the masters? Actually, it was the loss of hope and possibility that I experienced in the first and then the second ectopic pregnancy that had me lose confidence again in myself and what I was doing, and had me reevaluate everything, and had me, as it turned out, think about what else I could do and where I would like to work. And that's what drew me to do the masters, to study, to learn, because at that moment I thought it might not be possible for me to have children. And I thought very purposefully about where I wanted to grow my work and where I wanted to do it. In fact, I am a mum. I have 2 beautiful grown-up daughters who I'm proud of every day. And I'm very fortunate and, again, very grateful for the help that I got along the way. I treasure them every day dearly.
That is so beautiful. And wow, I feel like I need a part 2 just for that in itself. Gosh, look at you just dropping these massive, massive gems. I'm very conscious of time, so I'll ask you a couple questions. One of them would be, what would you say to your younger self at your lowest point during what you've just described? What would you say to your younger self to help you push through and not give in, stop putting that foot in front of the other? What would you tell yourself so that you could hear the message of encouragement that will get you through that darkest days?
I love you. I'm proud of you. You'll be all right.
Do you think you'd hear that?
I think I would tuck it away, and I would know it and reach for it and eventually believe it.
And would that be in your teens? Would that be when you're in your early 30s or during the pregnancies?
Throughout life, actually, Matt. I think I reach into that. I think it's what I would have loved to hear more of as a child. I certainly did hear it from my parents when my relationship with them grew and grew. And about 10, 12 years ago, they moved to live close to me. And during knowing that they would be living their last years close to me, that I had a role to play in loving them, caring for them, and ensuring that they felt some of the things that perhaps we hadn't felt when I was growing up. I wanted them to feel as they were growing old. And so finding that love, particularly in our relationship towards the end of their lives. Not that it hadn't been there before, but really feeling it and hearing both of them say those things to me. I can remember having a doorstep conversation with somebody who is a writer and sharing something similar about what we would have loved to have heard as children more. So maybe we did hear it, but we didn't take it in, to your point. Things got in the way. And I remember sharing with her what I would have loved to hear more of, but that I did hear now, was that I was loved, that they were proud of me, and that they believed in me. And I do think, in terms of losing confidence and resilience, not only self-belief matters, but the belief of others, particularly at those low points. You know, those low points, it's sometimes at the edge, at those low points, it's the belief of others that has, in me, that has helped me to find my feet again. Friends, family, and also being in nature has helped me to, to find the confidence I'd lost, to rebuild my resilience, to knit myself together again with their help. And I really have experienced that and feel especially privileged and humbled to have been with my sister when our mother died. She was one side of her, I was the other side of her, and I never really understood the phrase passing away, but it really did feel like our beloved mum passed away. And I think for both of us, it made us wish that we had been able to be there with my father when he died. Both my parents died where they wanted to be, which is great. And both were, as we were, greatly supported by others in their end of lives and in their dying.
If I could stretch through here and give you a big old cuddle, I really would. That was
Matt. Well, I would give you one back.
That definitely hit me. That was beautiful, and yeah, they did a great job in raising you. All the hard work, all the seeds they poured into you, they watered it, they dug deep to make sure that it was really, really buried into your being, who you are. The massive impact you're having, thankfully with the help of technology, the masses you're helping, they probably never knew. They hoped that you'd do great things, but they probably never knew you were going to achieve the greatness that you have and will continue to hit. So,
well, Matt, I have to interrupt you there because my dad used to say, when are you going to get a proper job? Because I definitely didn't do what they expected and or wanted me to do, and certainly not what they had imagined for me. And I think as I was growing up, I really do recognise that they did the best with what they had got and wanted the best for me. I think I have parented very, very differently, but with the same intentions of loving and caring and being there in a way that I didn't always feel that they were for me, but that we were able to find within each other and for each other, certainly in our lives.
well, the way I see it is like with my wife, with my kids, if I could say to God, this is what I want this, 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 and this, and this. Are you sure? Yeah, I want that. I would have got such a lesser version, lesser quality of life than the one that's provided to me. So as much as they may not have understood what you did or may not have appreciated, the weight of what you carry, you smashed every expectations. And I know that for a fact. And I'm so grateful for you. And I know that because of what they poured into you, that's coming out. whether it be right or wrong, it's still pouring out.
Absolutely.
Because what you didn't necessarily agree with, you're then changing it in a different way.
Agreed.
If you agreed with it, you perpetuate it. So love that for you, and so grateful for this conversation.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me on this conversation and being such a great podcaster.
I try. Just trying to emulate you, that's all.
Yeah.
So if I could ask you for the next 2 minutes to share where you're at, what you're doing, how people can get in contact with you, because I'm sure people will be like, I want a part 2. Can you just fill in some of these blanks for me? So the floor is yours, young lady.
Thank you. Well, I'd love a part 2 with you, Matt. And of course, you're going to be a guest on my podcast. So for listeners who would like to tune in and listen to guests I've already been in conversation with, do check out Leaders in Conversation with Anni Townend. The other place to find me is my website, Anni Townend. That's Annie without an E and Townend without an S, annitownend.com. And or you can email me directly at annie@annitownend.com. And I look forward to interacting with you. To any of your listeners, I wish you well in your journey of making sense of loss, of living your life and your leadership. And I truly look forward to connecting with you.
That was beautiful. Folks, you know how it is. I am just gobsmacked to be able to have conversation with people like this. And I guess for people that don't know much about Anni, it's the fact that her consistency, like even the branding, her website matches her podcasts. All of that, is the consistency is real. In her episodes, she thanks the editor. I should thank myself for editing. Thank you, future Matt, for editing this podcast episode. You did a great job. You know, she always giving flowers out, and that is just so beautiful, because I think not a lot of us do it. We always wait into the person's past and we give them flowers in their tombstone, which is no good to them at that point. She gives them their flowers. She's such a strong individual, and that phrase says, you never meet your strong person with an easy past. And this, even though it was a tip, the smallest tip of the iceberg, kind of gave you an insight into what she's had to overcome, what she's had to navigate. And it's made her the version of herself that she is today. And the beautiful thing about it is she's still growing, evolving, and willing to learn and change and adapt accordingly. She didn't give up when she had those pregnancies that didn't come to fruition, unfortunately. But then here she is with what she has. She may not have had the best relationship with her family, but she still pushed on, and thankfully it became something beautiful still. There's a lot of things that she's had to overcome. She took a course that, thankfully, the lecturer said to her, this ain't for you. And sometimes you need to have those honest conversations, which may not sound nice at the time, but the long-term results are right for the individual. And I think, if nothing else, folks, just take the honesty. And if you have to re-listen to it, so be it. But I think there's so much value in what's been communicated today. And I can't thank Anni enough for sharing. Hopefully she will come in for part 2. But as you guys all know, I'm a big fan of saying to you that your right now is not your forever. So please not dwell in it for too long, longer than you need to. And there's nothing about a caterpillar that tell you it's going to be a butterfly. Anni's stories tell you that in abundance. So look after yourself, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.